Welcome back to the Marvel Podcast for gifted listeners. Hopefully you are now a better informed Marvel movie fan and you know a little bit more about movie rights and character rights. So now, if you've been a fan of the MCU, you know a few things about Iron Man. He wears an armored suit, he was kidnapped by terrorists, he's played by Robert Downey Jr. But you probably don't know about his struggle with alcoholism, his many love affairs, or the fact that Howard and Maria Stark aren't even his birth parents. This episode we will cover this and so much more. I'm going to change up the structure of the episode a little bit, where Phase 1, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the major characters in Iron Man's life, and then Phase 2, we will go over the history of the character, which will hopefully be a little more coherent with the knowledge of who's who from Phase 1. Now, let's get into Phase 1. So, to start off, we have Tony Stark, the Iron Man. Howard Stark, the founder of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Tony's adoptive father. Maria Stark, Tony's adoptive mother. Amanda Armstrong, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and Tony's biological mother. Jude, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and Hydra double agent, and Tony's biological father. Arno Stark, Tony's adoptive brother, and the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark. Rigelian Recorder 451, a Rigelian robot who would genetically modify Arno Stark to be the pilot of the God-Killer weapon on Earth. Morgan Stark, a cousin of Tony, who gave Howard his stakes in Stark Industries and later felt betrayed by the Starks. Obadiah Stane, Howard/Tony Stark's industrial rival and the supervillain known as Ironmonger. James Rhodey Rhodes, one of Tony's best friends and the superhero known as War Machine. Pepper Potts, Tony's secretary and eventual personal assistant and ex-wife of Happy Hogan. Happy Hogan, a former boxer and Tony Stark's personal chauffeur and bodyguard, and the ex-husband of Pepper Potts. Jarvis, a human butler of Howard and Maria Stark, then Tony Stark, and then he would eventually be a butler to the Avengers. The Mandarin, wielder of the 10 Makluon rings and one of Iron Man's recurring villains. Justin Hammer, he is a recurring antagonist and business rival of Tony Stark. And Kirsten Witt, a man who claimed Tony stole his father's designs for the Iron Man suit and wanted revenge on Tony. And then, one quick note before we get into the history of Tony Stark. His origins were originally created during the Vietnam War, and every few decades or so, anytime his origin was related in the comics, the war would be updated for just the times. So, in like Iron Man in the MCU, it would be the Afghanistan War. But, like I said, originally it was the Vietnam War. And with that, let's move on to Phase 2 with the birth of Anthony Tony Stark. S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Amanda Armstrong fell in love with fellow agent Jude. They never reveal what his full name is, it's just Jude. And when the two were in love, at one point, Jude revealed to her that he was also a Hydra agent. The two would fight, Amanda would actually kill Jude, but this left her as a single pregnant woman. S.H.I.E.L.D. had set up a program for this for if any of their agents actually became pregnant. And they had a orphanage set up for this very scenario. Nick Fury wanted to put this child in the orphanage, but instead, Howard Stark overheard this and took the baby, keeping Amanda's one wish to name the child Anthony. The reason that Howard took this child is because him and Maria were trying to have the child of their own. And they had managed to conceive a child, but there was a complication with pregnancy, and the child would not be able to survive outside the womb. After Howard Stark had saved the Rigelian recorder 451, 451 would offer to genetically modify the unborn child, but Howard found out that when 451 was modifying the child, he put in a kill switch that could just end the child's life whenever. When Howard found this out, he began messing with the genetic code, but when Arno was born, he had to be put on permanent life support because of the genetic meddling that Howard had done. And since the world knew that the Starks were about to have a baby boy, that is why Howard would go on to adopt Tony, because just as a decoy. And Arno would live at the Maria Stark Hospice Center for most of his life. Starting at age 5, Tony would start to build stuff with erector sets, because to him, he said machines made more sense than people. And the example of this would be how Howard Stark he'd be perfectly happy dancing with Maria, enjoying a song, take a swig of his whiskey or scotch, whatever he was drinking, a brown alcoholic liquid. Then he'd immediately throw off and be like, "Ugh, I hate this song. I don't want to dance this anymore. I don't know why we even bother." And so this confused Tony. And also, when Tony started to get a little upset, Howard would tell him, "No, Starkmen are made of iron. You need to toughen up." At age 7, they sent Tony away to boarding school because Howard felt that he was too soft still. And so before he was sent off to boarding school, Howard had a little chat with Tony and said, "Listen, gold is soft, silver is brittle, but iron is strong, and Starkmen are made of iron." While at boarding school, Tony began reading stories about armored knights putting the greater good in front of themselves, possibly, influencing him later in life. At age 15, he graduated from MIT with a master's in physics and engineering. After leaving MIT, he would go on to Cambridge to study abroad, and he met Cassandra Gillespie, who was the daughter of a business rival of the Starks. When they first met, Tony would actually get tased because she had a bunch of bodyguards and no one was supposed to be talking to her. But after there's an apology issued to Tony, he went to dinner with her family. After dinner with the family, they were ambushed by Hydra because the Gillespie family had betrayed Hydra, and Tony saves the family but gets shot. When he's brought to the Gillespie home, they have their doctors work on him and put him in a sling. Tony has a conversation with the mother about how his father is a business rival to her, and it actually goes pretty well. They get returned to Cambridge, and Howard shows up and drags Tony back to the States because he doesn't want Tony associating with the Gillespies. And also, Howard has this weird thing how American doctors are better than European doctors, and tells him, "Yeah, I don't care that those Spanish doctors looked at your arm, you're getting tested by a real American doctor." A weird bit of European racism on Howard's part. And so when they return, Howard will keep Tony locked in the New York Stark mansion, telling him that Cassandra is a honeypot. Tony doesn't understand, and Howard explains that it's a spy term for when someone pretends to love you, but then they're just using you to get information. Tony doesn't believe him. He believes that Cass actually loves him, and so he breaks out, gets to London, and he convinces her to run away with him. When they're on a boat in New Zealand, Tony confesses that Howard had told him that Howard had told Tony that he believed that Cassandra was a honeypot. And Cassandra actually does reveal the truth to him, and this breaks Tony's heart. And he blames this as the beginning of his trouble with women, believing that this is why he can't have a stable relationship with women. After this, Tony starts to live kind of an erratic lifestyle, doing crazy hobbies like bungee jumping, skiing, skydiving. But everything came super easy to him, so he lost interest. Then shortly after this, the Howard and Maria die in a car accident. Unlike in the MCU, this car accident was due to faulty brakes in the car that they were driving. So, as one of the first acts that Tony does is he buys the car manufacturer that made that car, and he will fix the brake system just because he wanted to, because he was annoyed that this caused his parents' death. And this would be his new purpose in life, is finding fixes to broken things, essentially. Or at least it was until he got bored again. Tony made weapons and technology for the military, and he was actually over in Vietnam doing a demonstration of a super magnet, actually, not the Jericho missile. When he was done with his first demonstration of a super magnet, Tony was heading on to the next demonstration when he activates a tripwire, setting off a booby trap, and caused shrapnel to be near his heart. The enemy doctors said he only had a few days to live until the shrapnel got to his heart, and so they would convince him to make weapons with what time he had left. And as we know, in captivity, he goes on to make the Mark I armor. After Tony's first day of building weapons, they give him an assistant, Ho Yin Sen, which we meet him in the first Iron Man film. And Tony actually knew of Ho Yin Sen from before because he read his books in college. Tony shares that he is going to build the Mark I armor with Yin Sen, and they get to work doing it. And also the chest plate for the Mark I is basically the arc reactor that we see in the movies. And just as we see in the first movie, when they boot up the suit so Tony can escape, they need more time for it to boot up. So Yin-Sen runs out to distract the guards and gives Tony more time to escape with the suit. And when he gets out, he does destroy the entire enemy camp and flies away. Or actually, he doesn't fly away, he actually walks away into the night. And that's kind of how the very first story of Iron Man ends. Iron Man did premiere in an anthology series, Tales of Suspense. And I just have a little side note on the book that he appeared in. And it's just about the last story that was in the book. It was just an interesting twist on the Adam and Eve mythos, where in this story, humans are fleeing Earth because the sun is dying. Right as the last humans leave Earth, there's one couple that stays behind because this is their world and they want to stay there. And just as they are basically accepting their fate, a new sun explodes, and the two humans look at each other and go, well, we have to repopulate the Earth. And it's basically like, yes, Adam, we will do that. Yes, Eve, we shall. And it's just an interesting twist on the Adam and Eve mythos. And I know that doesn't have anything to do with Iron Man. It's just an interesting inclusion in Tales of Suspense 39, which Iron Man had debuted in. After Tony leaves the camp, he wanders into the jungles of Vietnam and comes across Colonel James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, who was fighting off the enemy, and Tony agrees that if he can get him out, like, Tony and Rhodey kind of make an agreement, if Tony gets him out, then Rhodey will keep quiet about the Iron Man suit. So when Tony returns to the United States, he redesigns the suit to make a layered chest plate so that he can keep his heart pumping, so that he doesn't have to wear the Iron Man suit all the time. And then he would make the suit public and made it known that the suit would be available for everybody, and it would be called the Human Machine. Shortly after, though, terrorists would try to steal the armor after Tony had announced it, and Tony wore the Iron Man armor for the first time as a battle mechanic, and decided that the public could not be trusted with this type of technology, which is a recurring theme throughout Iron Man's entire comic history, is that he believes the world cannot be trusted with his technology, which is something that is proven true time and time again. And also, the human machine would have helped make humanity the best that they could be, which we do see in a weird Scarlet Witch book where chaos magic runs rampant, and we kind of see a version of the world if Tony did make this sort of armor. And we also do see another version, not armor, but the Extremis virus in the Superior Iron Man, which we will get to towards the end of the episode. So after Tony decides not to release the suit to the world, he is at a tennis match with Joanna Navina, and there's an attack. Joanna convinces Tony to don the Iron Man suit, and he does, and defeats the terrorist. And that's where the excuse of Iron Man as a bodyguard of Tony Stark came. And this is the excuse Tony was going to give at the end of Iron Man 1, before he said, nah, I am Iron Man. But after this, he does end his engagement to Joanna because he believes he cannot be a good husband. He soon lets Happy know that he is Iron Man, and he also starts to have feelings for Pepper, but before the two could engage in any sort of relationship, Happy and Pepper start a whirlwind romance, and at one point would be married. The first superpowered villain Tony would face is Anton Vanko, who has almost no relation to his counterpart in Iron Man 2, because in the books, Vanko is known as the Crimson Dynamo, who is basically like a Russian Iron Man, has a bigger suit, and would actually wind up being defeated by Tony. And in Iron Man 2, Ivan Vanko would be a weird amalgamation of the Crimson Dynamo and Whiplash, and also Kirsten Witt. The next big villain that Tony would face would be the Mandarin, who yields 10 magic rings that each have different abilities and powers, and are not like the 10 rings of the MCU. The reason that this was changed is because they didn't want the 10 rings from the comics to look like they were the Infinity Stones of the MCU. It's a weird thing, and actually the MCU version of the 10 rings has made its way into the comics now. After being the Mandarin, Tony would go on to become a founding member of the Avengers and donate the Manhattan Mansion to be the base of operation for the Avengers. And this would also be... And Jarvis would serve as the butler for the Avengers. Tony would suffer 2 serious bouts of alcoholism. The first, he was able to manage, but the second one caused him to stop being Iron Man, and he would hand the suit over to Rhodey for the time being. During his second bout of alcoholism, Tony would lose Stark Industries to Obadiah Stane, and Stane would rebrand the company to Stane Industries. This is actually a comic I had when I was younger. I mean, I still have it. And the cover I always thought was interesting because it showed Stark Industries, the sign, and it was a Crane taking the RK off and replacing it with the NE, while Tony's saying they're all drunk and watching it. After Stane took over, he told Iron Man that if he can find injuries, a woman who was surgically made to be irresistible to any man, then she might be able to get Tony to stop drinking, since she is the one who got him to start drinking again in the first place. When Rhodey gets to her as Iron Man, he's actually able to resist her looks because he thinks she's too perfect. And also she explains that she cannot make Tony stop drinking because there's something in him that would make him want to drink. She didn't actually get him to start drinking, she just kind of like pushed it a little bit and boom, he started drinking. Rhodey then returns to Stane and tells him that he released Andreas and that the fight for Tony's recovery is not over. Stane then tells him that the armor belongs to Tony Stark, or the armor belongs to Stark Industries, and since he owns Stark Industries now, he owns the Iron Man armor. Rhodey basically tells him no. And then Rhodey would go on to break into Tony's lab which was guarded by the Knight, which was a living chess piece designed by Stain to act as muscle. But Rhodey would get access to all the suits and launch them into the Atlantic Ocean, and S.H.I.E.L.D. would move to collect them. S.H.I.E.L.D. would not get them, but they would be gathered by the U.S. government and put into deep storage. Shortly thereafter, Rhodey had truly began to enjoy being Iron Man, and thought that after Tony became sober, he would want the armor back. And this caused Rhodey to get really angry and annoyed at Tony. And that was because the Iron Man suit had not been properly calibrated to Rhodey's brain. So the electrodes in the helmet would basically make him angry towards Tony. After Tony donned a simpler suit, he was able to calm Rhodey down, recalibrate the helmet for Rhodey, and the two would operate as Iron Men. Tony would eventually leave New York City and go to the West Coast and join the West Coast Avengers. While with the West Coast Avengers, Tony would upgrade his suit, and then Stain would steal the designs for an earlier suit, and thinking that Tony might actually recover from alcoholism, and he became the Ironmonger. After a battle with Tony, and Tony defeats him, Stain actually goes on to kill himself, which, yeah. Now with Stain gone, Tony recovers his fortune and decides to start Stark Enterprises in Silicon Valley. During what is known as Armor Wars, Justin Hammer would hire Spymaster to steal Iron Man armor designs and sell them off to criminals. Tony, disgusted by these actions, finds Hammer and destroys the blueprints that had his armor designs on them. However, the government goes on to condemn Iron Man because of the actions similar to how they tried to condemn him in Iron Man 2. And, except in the comics, Stark says that the person who he says that Iron Man was fired as a Stark Industries employee, and he would make up a false identity for the pilot of the Iron Man armor and hand it over to the government. And then he would have the armor destroyed in a battle with the government, thus effectively killing the original pilot and so quote-unquote Iron Man. Tony would build a new, more sophisticated suit that even Spymaster couldn't hack, and he would tell the government that there is a new pilot in the armor. After this, there would be an old love interest that would shoot Tony, and for a while he would need the Iron Man armor to walk until they were able to install a microchip in Tony's spine to allow him to walk without the armor. But this biochip would cause degenerative nerve damage, and when Kirsten DeWitt showed up in Tony's life, he would use an organic virus to essentially kill Tony. Thankfully, the team at Stark International was able to put Tony in a cryosleep until they would use a neuron chip to restore Tony's body functions by implanting it in the back of his skull. And while Tony is out at this time, he kind of remembers dying, and this is when he relives his childhood, and reliving such things as Howard's abuse, going off to Cambridge, going off to MIT, all of that. Well, once they get the chip installed and they start running the program to restore Tony and get his brain to rewire and basically have biological functions again, Tony sees a light similar to when he was dying, and he goes to it and he starts to rewrite the biological way his body works. And he actually, on the screen that the Stark Industries employees were using, he says, "Hey, I'll take it from here. Miss me?" And during this time, Rhodey would serve as CEO of Stark International because of Tony's apparent death. When Tony did return, Rhodey was mad at him about faking his death and would take up the mantle of War Machine because he didn't want to be Iron Man anymore because he was just disgusted by that whole situation. Rhodey and Tony would get into conflict over some of Rhodey's actions as CEO, but after the two duked out in their respective armors, their friendship would be repaired. Tony would go on to dismantle the West Coast Avengers and establish Force Works, where they used a combination of the Scarlet Witch's powers and a Hex mainframe to predict attacks and natural disasters and try to be proactive about them, so that they could revenge them. At this point, Tony's secret identity had kind of gotten out because of, just a whole bunch of other stuff. And so Tony would battle a villain named Mentalo. And after beating Mentalo, he would secretly use the villain's global mind control device to wipe his secret identity from everyone's minds. And then he would go on to tell the people he truly trusted. And this actually would kind of work similar to the spell in the Spider-Man One More Day storyline, where once he told them, hey, I'm Iron Man, they would remember all the stuff he did as Iron Man. While fighting Whiplash, Tony was struck by lightning, causing his armor to become sentient. And eventually it was revealed that it wasn't just that the armor was sentient, it was actually being taken over by Ultron. And the armor would think it would be better than Tony and try to take over Tony's life. But eventually the armor would sacrifice itself to save Tony because of Tony's failing heart. A little bit after this, Tony would suffer technophobia, and he would give up being Iron Man and Tony Stark. He would give away his fortune and work as Hogan Potts at an electronics store. Eventually, Tony started to get more ideas, and he really couldn't stay away from inventing, and he would make a new set of armor. And he would work on the Mark 19, which would be known as the SKIN armor, or the skin armor. And basically, the material he used was kind of liquidy, and it would be as bouncy as a basketball, but once it hardened, it would be hard as adamantium. Ultron would also attempt to use this armor, and so Tony wound up abandoning the armor and upgrade to the Mark 20. Throughout his time as Iron Man, Tony would patent a lot of technology, including a lot that would be used in the Iron Man armor. The Department of Defense would seal away these patents because they were too dangerous to be used by anyone other than Tony Stark. The Undersecretary of Defense, Sonny Burch, would unseal these patents and sell them to government contractors to make them look good and get these contractors contracts with the government. They get a little kickback, or he would get a little kickback. Tony discovers this when there's 2 failed attempts to use these patents that cost and almost cost military lives. When Tony finds out about this, he confronts Burch, and Burch basically tells him, you can't do anything, and the President and Chief of Staff won't do anything either. So, Tony just goes straight to the President, which in this comic was George H.W. He's even depicted, in the comic. And after talking with the President wants to name Tony as the Secretary of Defense. But Senate had to vote on him to be Secretary of Defense, and so that's what Tony works on for the next few days. He actually will give up all his stocks in Stark Industries and make it publicly known that he is fighting for the American people. And he will try, as Secretary of Defense, to make it... he would make a promise that there would be no more deaths in war if he was Secretary of Defense. During his Senate hearing to see if they will accept him, he actually gets an almost unanimous no. But because of all this technology that Burch has been selling off, there was a crisis. And Burch was actually trying to sell off a bunch of old armor that had been recovered from earlier when Rhodey had launched all the armor into the ocean. And so Tony had left the hearing and went on to go save all the lives of these military people. He was able to actually connect to all the armors, remotely pilot them, and get everyone to safety. The Chief of Staff would explain to Tony that, yeah, you did lose the vote, but because they never actually got to finish the vote, they reconvened and re-voted. And because of Tony's heroic acts the day before, the Senate reconvened, re-voted, and confirmed Tony Stark as the 24th Secretary of Defense of the United States. Tony would serve as Secretary of Defense for an undisclosed amount of time, and it doesn't really state how long he served as Secretary of Defense. The only kind of timeline is that he's Secretary of Defense all the way up until he is sworn in as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. The Avengers would be disassembled after the Scarlet Witch causes the deaths of Ant-Man, Vision, and Clint Barton's Hawkeye. And she also manipulated Stark into attacking Latvian ambassador in the UN. And then, an undisclosed time later, because of comics, there would be a breakout at the supervillain Supermax prison known as the Raft. And I've mentioned this breakout in pretty much every other character profile episode I've already done. And a bunch of villains break out, and a team of heroes is assembled. Tony then sees that the world does need the Avengers, and they create the new Avengers. And they would go on to use Stark Tower as their base of operations, like they do in a certain movie franchise. The MCU. The next thing that Tony has to deal with is the Extremis virus, which was developed by Maya Hansen and Dr. Aldrich Killian, that they had developed as part of a subsidiary of Stark Industries, trying to develop a new super soldier program. And they basically described it as microsurgery experimental robotics, and that's how people would be healed with the virus. In a battle with a terrorist, Tony would get injured and would be forced to use the Extremis virus on himself. When he had the virus in him, he realized he was able to control technology with his mind, and he would carry and modify this virus for years. Tony would soon learn about a government plan to enact a Superhero Registration Act, which would lead to the comic Civil War. And actually, at first, Tony was against it. But after a group of heroes known as the New Warriors mess up in a fight with a supervillain that killed 600 people, mostly children, Tony decides to be pro-registration, so that at least if there is a hero on the side of the government, that would hopefully stop the government from throwing the book at the heroes. He also saw as a way to do what he originally intended for the group known as the Illuminati, being able to see threats and stop them before they happen. He would convince Peter Parker, Spider-Man, to join his side and unmask himself to the public. This would lead to troubles that in Peter's life that you can hear about in the Spider-Man-centric episode. The Civil War would end when Captain America was assassinated by the Red Skull. After the Civil War, Tony would become director of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the suggestion of Maria Hill, because she thought that it would be a great way to piss off certain people, or Tony would do a great job. And during this, he was no longer acting as Secretary of Defense at this time. Tony's tenure as S.H.I.E.L.D. director was somewhat controversial within the world of 616. A good thing, he would form the Mighty Avengers, who would be run by Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. After this, he would work with the Illuminati to exile Hulk, which, even though he didn't order this as S.H.I.E.L.D. director, is still under his reign as S.H.I.E.L.D. director. When Tony then builds the Hulkbuster armor, just in case the Hulk ever did return to Earth. Well, the Hulk did return, and he wanted to take his revenge first on the Illuminati, the ones who had sent him away. So Tony would don the Hulkbuster armor, and him and Hulk would duke it out and actually destroy most of New York City. Hulk would take Tony to a stadium where the rest of the heroes were, and then with a combination of the Hulkbuster and other heroes, including Sentry, as well as a space laser that Tony installed, the Hulk was able to be subdued. After this, Tony would pull money from many sources, including S.H.I.E.L.D., to rebuild Avengers Tower and most of New York City from this battle between him and the Hulk. While Stark is acting director, the secret Skrull invasion takes place, and Tony was put out of commission when an alien virus clashed with the Extremis virus and left him near crippled and having Black Widow needing to defend him. When the war with the Skrulls was over and won by the heroes, the President of the United States, who is now Barack Obama, stripped Tony of his position as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and disbanded S.H.I.E.L.D. because of this. Now Tony has suffered a great loss. His technology was non-functional, his corporations were in dismay. He had many new enemies, and little to no allies willing to help him with any problems. And if this was not bad enough, the president also would disband the Avengers and handed the Avengers initiative over to Norman Osborn to run. And this is when we would get the Dark Avengers. Tony would use what he had of his failing extremis powers to actually wipe the database of the Superhero Registration Act, so that Norman Osborn would not be able to access any of the information about the heroes. Tony would then flee, and Norman would gain access to all of Tony's armors, and he would suit up as the Iron Patriot. Tony would go to Atlantis, he'd battle Namor, he'd win. After he escaped Atlantis, Norman put a bounty on his head, and this would cause Tony to flee to Saigon and find the original lab that he had been trapped in all those years ago when he had built the Mark I armor. He was able to reconstruct his Mark I armor, which he had used because of how bad the extremists had gotten. It was the only technology simple enough that he would be able to pilot. Norman and Tony would face off, but because this armor was worse than the one that Norman was wearing, Norman would actually beat the shit out of Tony. And Pepper was able to capture this on video. It went viral. And so Norman would be stripped of his position, but Tony was put into a vegetative state because of this, and Donald Blake would be in charge of him, as Tony had made him his power of attorney. Tony would have a plan to boot himself back up, but to do so, it would actually be somewhat complicated. He would need the electromagnet from the suit of armor Pepper was using, be put onto his chest, that would run his biology. A backup of his memory from a hard drive from Maria Hill to be put into him, and then he would need to channel Thor's lightning through Captain America's shield to revive him. But this does not work, so they then call in Doctor Strange to help revive him now. The Ghost tries to stop them, but the team helping revive Tony is able to stop them. When the transplant was complete, it was realized that the backup memory Tony had was incomplete, and Tony actually had no memory of anything that had happened up to, including, and after Civil War. And when he learned about the events of Civil War, he actually was disgusted with himself. After there was a siege on Asgard that most of the heroes were involved in, but Tony was out of commission for, the Superhero Registration Act was repealed, and Tony would reconcile with Thor and Captain America. Tony would build new armor with the help of Mr. Fantastic and start a new company called Stark Resilience, which would not do any arms deals and would work using repulsor technology to help the citizens of the world with using it as a energy source, kind of what we see in the first Avengers movie. Odin's older brother Kull wanted to rule Earth, and he would have his group be known as the Serpents. During this takeover, the citizens of Paris had been turned into stone, and this caused Tony to act. Tony tried to defeat one of Kull's allies and found he just couldn't do it. And so the Allfather grants Tony access to Nidavellir. There, Tony would have a slight relapse of alcoholism because of the guilt he felt over the citizens of Paris, but to sober up enough to make weapons to aid in the fight against the Serpents. He would make his own armor, and he would also make weapons for everybody. After this event and the loss of Thor, Tony would actually destroy all the weapons on Nidavellir and convince the Allfather to help reinstate the people who were statues in Paris. And then he would return to Earth and quit drinking again. Tony would battle the Mandarin again. He would isolate himself after this battle and actually leave Earth for space to try to recover and rediscover himself. But when he returns to Earth, his life on Earth is put into question, and he takes up an offer by Star-Lord to become a Guardian of the Galaxy. While in space, Tony meets Rigelian Recorder 451, where the Recorder recounts Tony of his seeming birth and right to pilot the Godkiller armor, because Rigelian thinks this is Arno. Except Arno didn't know that this was not Arno, that this was Tony, and the Rigelian Recorder actually forced Tony to pilot the Godkiller because he believed Tony to be the pilot that he had engineered all those years ago. But when Tony couldn't pilot it, the Rigelian recorder would destroy his consciousness and the God-Killer armor. Tony was able to escape this and went back to Earth to find out who was supposed to be the pilot of the God-Killer armor. When he returned to Earth, he discovered Arno Stark, his adopted brother, who had been hidden away all these years, and informed him that Recorder 451 was no longer a threat to him, and now he was free to have a life. And the two would work to build a better world. Arno would eventually use the technology of the day to fix the regenerative disease that he had been cursed with, and he'd be able to function as a normal human being. After this, Tony would go on to become the superior Iron Man, which is who people thought might show up in Multiverse of Madness, played by Tom Cruise. And honestly, Tom Cruise could pull off the psychopath that was the superior Iron Man. After a fight involving Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom and a Red Skull with the brain of Charles Xavier, there is a moral inversion spell cast, changing the morals of anyone caught in it. When Doom and the Scarlet Witch cast a reinversion spell, Tony had protected himself using a shield, and now he was just a total piece of shit. He would go to San Francisco and put the Extremis virus in the water supply of San Francisco. And he did this because in San Francisco they can't have bottled water in the comics. The Extremis virus in the water would be Extremis 3.0 and make everybody super mild level beautiful. However, after a day free trial, the Extremis app would tell everybody they had to pay $9.99 to keep their beauty and keep the Extremis virus working in their body. When Pepper finds out about this, she activates a failsafe, which was created in case Tony ever went bad, which was an old suit of armor with consciousness before Tony's morals had switched. It was one that was about 8 years previous. While the suit got caught up on modern times, Tony would fight Daredevil, and Tony would use a specific form of Extremis to fix Matt's eyesight as a way to try to get him to be on his side of the Extremis debate. Matt refuses, and when he confronts Tony again, Tony traps him in his armor and delivers electroshock to Daredevil, rendering him out of commission and stopping that one adversary. Pepper would try to stop Tony, but Tony would ultimately manipulate her and destroy the backup of himself and leave Pepper defeated. Pepper would, however, use a giant news conglomerate that she had bought out from under Tony to show the truth about Extremis and at least take that down. Incursions would start to begin and start to damage Earth 616, and the Illuminati would work to stop them. But the last incursion from Earth 1610 would see the shield from 1610 invade 616, and eventually the incursion would destroy both Earths. After 616 was restored, the moral compass of Tony had been restored, and there was no trace of his quote-unquote superior self in this new reality. Then we would get the second superhero civil war, where a new Inhuman known as Ulysses would be born, and it seems that his power allows him to see visions of the future. Tony sees this, he questions this, but Carol Danvers thinks that this is the way to prevent more deaths. So Carol would take the word of Ulysses, and they would go try to stop threats before they happen. One of which being Thanos, and she would take Rhodey with her, and Rhodey would actually die from this, and from Thanos playing his fist through Rhodey's stomach and guts. Tony and Carol would clash, and basically this civil war would end when Ulysses' powers basically manifest past human understanding, and he goes off space to become a Celestial. Tony would die shortly after this. Dr. Doom would take over as Iron Man, using the moral compass of Tony to try to do good in the world. Tony would have his AI consciousness seek out Riri Williams and instruct her on how to be a new hero. which is how we get Ironheart, because Riri had an affinity for building suits, and Tony thought that she would be a good successor. Tony and Rhodey's bodies would be reconstructed cell by cell, and they would be resurrected. Rhodey actually took a bit to pilot the War Machine armor again, because he had PTSD from when Thanos killed him. So Tony actually buys him a really big tank that he gets to drive. Iron Man would establish new Avengers, and their base would be in the corpse of a Celestial. But Tony would be worried about his humanity because of the reconstruction. He would wind up having a battle inside his own consciousness, and he would actually work with an AI version of his mother to escape and gain control of his body again. Arno would take over Stark Unlimited, since the reconstruction pod used to bring Tony back to life was designed by him, meaning that Stark is technically his property, and so are all of his assets. Arno would try to combine human and robots into one species, but this was stopped by Tony. But Arno wasn't done. After Tony's consciousness was put into a new bioengineered body from the DNA of his parents, Tony would stop Arno once and for all with a virtual suit of armor, and then Tony would convert the armor Arno was wearing into a life-sustaining suit for Arno to live in. Tony would try to distance himself and wear a retro-style Iron Man armor, and he would work with former Avengers ally Hellcat to be a better crime fighter. But shortly after, Tony would gain the power Cosmic, and this would help him in the King in Black Symbiont War. After the Symbiont King is defeated, Tony would use the blueprint of his powers Cosmic to awaken the Celestial that had been the Avengers' main base, and the Celestial would go on to judge the entire planet in the crossover event known as Judgment Day, which I do plan to do a full episode on because that is a very interesting modern crossover episode. And I have mentioned this in the Spider-Man episode because it was a cool thing that happened in that episode, or in that event with Spider-Man. After Judgment Day, the human supremacist Fei Long would stage a hostile takeover of Stark Unlimited and use the tech that was at his disposal to make Stark Sentinels, which were basically Iron Man armor with Sentinel mindsets. If you do not know, Sentinels are mutant-killing robots. Tony would ally with Emma Frost and eventually, quote-unquote, marry her to be able to probe Fei Long's mind. Tony would then find out about a new material known as Mysterium that was near indestructible, was immune to magic, and could even stop spider sense. Tony would then go to Nidavellir again with Ironheart, and they would forge Mysterium ships, as well as a set of Mysterium armor and a Sentinel Buster armor. After this, Tony would try to continue his relationship with Emma Frost, but she politely declined. But she did use her vast resources to help restore Stark's fortune, and he took control of Stark Unlimited again. The Roxxon Oil Corporation would resurrect Justin Hammer and try to take over Stark Unlimited from the inside. The war between Stark Unlimited and Roxxon Oil is still going on when I record this episode. And with that, we have covered the life of Anthony, Tony Stark, the first Iron Man. From being told he needs to be strong like iron, being sent to boarding school, being betrayed by the woman he loves, getting shrapnel in his heart, and becoming the ironclad hero Iron Man, Tony had a somewhat long life. I only say somewhat long because of how many times he died and came back. So, now let's go over the top 5 things we learned in today's episode. Number 1. Tony Stark was not the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark, but was treated as their own. Number 2. Tony was originally in the jungles of Vietnam for a military tech demonstration and sets off a booby trap that causes the shrapnel in his heart, and his captors didn't even know who he was at first. Number 3. Tony started off as Iron Man using the cover of Iron Man being his bodyguard, but would have to leave the mantle a handful of times due to alcoholism. Number 4. Tony has held many positions, such as CEO of multiple Stark-named companies, a founding Avenger, Secretary of Defense, and even director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And number 5. Even when Tony tries to give up being Iron Man or his inventing lifestyle, he always returns because the desire to create and build is too great. I hope you enjoyed this look into the life of Tony Stark / Iron Man. I try a new format out for this episode, so I'll see how it's received and possibly use it for future character profiles. If you want to know more specifically about some of the arcs of Tony's life, please let me know, because I would be happy to delve deeper into certain storylines. These profile episodes are meant to be more of an overview of the character, and the specific storylines will be dived into deeper in future episodes, because these episodes are already clocking in at an hour, and if I went into every storyline, they would be 2-3 hours. The next episode I will be doing will be about the super team known as Thunderbolts, mainly because the movie's coming out and I only know so much about them. I'm going to find out how they started out, who's been members, and how does it relate to the movie that is about to come out. So, join me next time to learn more about this. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by myself, James Bazinski. Intro music, outro music, and sound effects sourced from freesound.org. You can find us on Instagram at TMPFGL, YouTube at The Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners, and on TikTok at TMPFGL. Any feedback, questions, or suggestions can be emailed to tmpfgl@gmail.com. Please like, subscribe, comment, and rate the show wherever you listen. Until next time, gifted listeners, thank you for listening, and Excelsior!